Hi, my name is Rutendo Nyamuda, and welcome to another exciting and a little bit cold episode of In My 20s. I am freezing. I hope you are keeping warm, and I hope you are well wherever you are in the world. So coming up in today's In My 20s episode, we speak to Khumo Theko. She is a trends analyst, and she's going to be giving us a little bit of insights into what we've been seeing lately with a lot of brands diversifying and releasing bandages of all hues, shades, and colors. Is this just a short-term trend, or will we be seeing more active diversity in companies and branding? We also speak about African trends and African innovation and the future of technology on the continent. And wrapping up the conversation, we also speak about colonial tax. And do you know that there are still countries on the African continent that are paying colonial tax? Very interesting. So sit back, relax. Do not forget to comment. Let us know your thoughts on today's episode. And grab a hot beverage before you press play. Enjoy. Anyway, so Khumo, welcome back to In My 20s. As you know, love to start off with the 10-second elevator pitch. So who are you? How do you summarize who you are in about 10 seconds?
Okay, so my name is Khumo Theko. I am currently a digital trend analyst, and I moonlight as a person that is continuously trying to learn and very curious about the African continent. And I hope to one day get to a point where I will be noted as someone who is a curator and a thought leader within the African continent.
So poised, so poised. I love that.
I practiced. So.
You practiced. Tell me, what is the digital trends analyst? What does that mean? What do you do? Can I be one?
Yes, you can. Anyone can be whatever they want to be, remember? So basically, as a trend analyst, essentially what you do is you spot trends, you analyze them, and how I like to see it, especially from an African perspective, is that you unpack what trends are relevant to the continent, and you highlight which trends are relevant in which regions. So essentially what I'm currently doing is I'm working for a digital agency, and we essentially stands in remaining relevant on social media by the use of data. So we see what's happening on social media, we see what other campaigns, what other companies and other agencies are doing, and we also spot different trends, use data to back it up, show to the brands, and hopefully they use that information to create campaigns that are in line with the zeitgeist.
Interesting. And I have to ask, when you say the continent, when you speak of Africa, are we putting a spotlight on South Africa and calling South Africa Africa, or do you actually mean the entire continent?
So, like I mentioned, that I moonlight as someone who's very curious about the continent. I actually have my own website called I See Africa. And essentially, it is a content hub that unpacks trends that are happening in the continent. So it is including South Africa, but not limited to South Africa. It would kind of be a disservice if I was just like, I see Africa, but no, I actually see South Africa. So we basically look at what is happening in terms of different regions and different countries and bring that to the surface.
Okay, very interesting. I would love to go into, discussing, our main segment. There are a number of parts to today, but when you're talking about digital trends and looking at trends, the last couple of weeks, we've seen arguably the largest global Black Lives Matter movement in the entire world, across the entire world. And with that has also come with certain businesses or agencies that have kind of just come out of the woodwork, and suddenly where there wasn't diversity or inclusivity, when they were posting who their board members were, it was like one Black person and
the black person, right?
Exactly. And there was a diversity person. I was like, diversity. You're only Black person in your company. your billion-dollar company is head of diversity. And then with that, also corporates like Band-Aid, for example, coming out with now suddenly we have bandages that are not just that have diversity colors. So now there's a
Yeah.
Band-Aid for my skin tone and your skin tone and different skin tones. I mean, in terms of trends, like, is this what we're going to be seeing more of? Yeah, I don't know. What do you think?
So post-COVID, the conversation around diversity and inclusivity was very big. We started to see a lot more corporations having wider discussions about what diversity and inclusivity means within their workspace. You started seeing, like you're saying, positions being opened up of people who were tackling diversity and inclusivity. And those were essentially becoming job titles because businesses realized the importance of ensuring that their workspace is diverse, and not just from a race perspective, not just from a gender perspective, but even from a disability perspective, and even having conversations about whether or not workspaces are very are catering to people with disabilities, but not even people with just physical disabilities, but neuro disabilities. We even saw like the likes of Ernest and Young in America had actually opened up a program where they started hiring people who are autistic, and they started trying that out.
Yeah.
So that has been in the works. I think what we're going to start to see is that with the Black Lives Matter movement, it's mainly been, especially from a corporate perspective, saying that, you know, companies need to start hiring Black people, acknowledging Black people, give people positions, because they've worked for it and because they have actually proven it, right? We've always spoken about the glass ceiling. We've always spoken about how, you know, you're told to work hard when you're in high school, you're told to work hard when you're in varsity, and you get into the work world and you realize that the goalpost keeps changing. But yet other people who have done the same, has followed the same steps as you, seem to be getting further. So with regards to inclusivity and diversity, especially in the cases of Black Lives Matter, I think what we may start seeing is that businesses will start to be a lot more, I don't even want to say open, because it sounds like we're being given like it's like a charity, but we're going to start to see businesses become a lot more cognizant of inclusivity in their workspace. And on the flip side, if businesses are not doing that, you're going to start to see more employees openly speaking about that as well. We saw that with Starbucks. On the one hand, they were talking about how much, you know, they support their employees and they support the Black community. And then on the flip side, they were telling their employees that they can't wear T-shirts that say Black Lives Matter at work because it's too political. And people were like, but wait, so you can say it on social media, but you don't want to act on it within the workplace. And if businesses are not cognizant of it, don't be so quick to say something on social media, because your customers and your employees will call you out for it if you don't act on what you're saying.
Yeah. So essentially what you're saying is pre-COVID, there were a number of initiatives or a number of companies who were slowly starting to do with it, starting to be more diverse and more inclusive. And now kind of we're seeing that roll out, or we will be seeing a lot more of that roll out. My question is, sorry, I'm going to let you answer, but my question is kind of like, so yes, you could have been doing stuff before, but it seems like personally, I'm not going to lie, things just coming out of the woodwork. So it's great to finally put Black people and people of color in these positions. I'm just like, why has it taken so long? I mean, down to The Bachelor. Why are we having our first Black Bachelor now? How many years has that series been running for? So my question is, are you doing it because you really want to do it, or are you doing it because you're afraid of the backlash of not doing it? Then is your heart really in the right place?
So that's a very good question. And I think for me, when you were talking, my thing was, are brands doing it because they see the importance of it? So they see the importance of diversity within their workspace,
Mm,
or are they doing it, as you said, because they just want to ensure that they still remain relevant?
mm,
We can't put a blanket on that answer. But I think what brands will be judged on is how they continue to be part of that movement and continue to ensure that the work that they do is not just on social media with regards to diversity and inclusivity, and it's not just with regards to the Black Lives Matter movement. I think what the Black Lives Matter movement highlighted was that there is a societal issue with regards to race globally. And it what we also need to be aware of is that what happens in the workplace always can influence what happens in society, because business is a part of society.
mm,
And we're moving into a space with conscious consumers where people aren't just looking to the government for change, but they're looking to businesses for change.
mm,
So it will depend how important a role a business thinks their position is within society, whether or not that is going to have a lasting impact in terms of how they are actually doing it, and whether or not their heart is really in the right place.
all right. And in the beginning, you mentioned that part of your job is to be a cultural and trend spotter as well. And I'm not just saying this, but a lot of the famous trends that we have seen in the world have come from Black culture, African culture, people of color, and various cultures. It hasn't been a West thing. I mean, even the West has taken things definitely from the East as well, but it's never, the West somehow manages to take things that are already in cultures, be it African culture, East cultures, does something with it, puts a label on it, gives it a name, and then suddenly it's like, oh wow, this is revolutionizing. We're the first. I personally get like, I feel like attacked sometimes when I see that. I'm like, mm, but do you know your history? Do you know where it's really come from? But um, there's a lot we can do by looking back, but even looking ahead. If we're looking ahead at some of the African innovation, technology, a lot of stuff that are coming from the continent even now. I mean, we have, the likes of Cape Town that is called like, what is it, like the African Silicon Valley, or, uh, all of these names. Rwanda also very technologically savvy, and a number of other African countries. What would you say is like your biggest fear when it comes to the future of African innovation and that technology space?
Oh, there's so many fears. I think for me, the one thing that's kind of mind-boggling for me is just the level of ownership with regards to the expansion of innovation within our continent. Um, you know, as much as a lot of governments such as Rwanda and Ethiopia are really trying to steer their economy towards a technologically based economy versus just continuously relying on minerals and resources like we have for centuries. And we're starting to see, the likes of Nigeria getting a lot more international investment with regards to its fintech. I think for me, the concern is that there isn't a lot of um, African investment in African projects. So we are mainly working on international funding, which then brings to question, as much as there is innovation within our continent, does it really belong to us? So the fact that Juma, which is a big e-commerce company within the continent, when they went onto the stock exchange, it was in New York.
Sure.
And I found that problematic, and I saw that there was much conversation about whether or not Juma should actually be counted as an African company. Yes, it works in the continent, and yes, it provides a service within the continent, but their head office is not in any of the African countries. So I think for me, in terms of innovation within the continent, I would really hope that the governments will really start to be a lot more strict in ensuring that ownership remains within the continent and remains with African people. So if
Mm,
you're starting an initiative or you're starting a project that is going to have some form of great revolution or evolution within African communities, ensure that the headquarters is in one of the countries in this continent, and that when it goes into a stock exchange, put it on one of the stock exchanges within this continent.
Mm. But how would government even assist in that? I mean, if you're saying one of the biggest issue is African investment in African countries, so many things popped into my mind. So on the one hand, I'm like, are we not believing in the creation or development of African products and African things until they get the blue stamp from an international investment? And then suddenly we're like, oh my word, me too. I also support this African country, because you can actually see it even in some of our, not all, but even some of our international and I say that international because I think that they're celebrities or well-known people even on the continent, but until they reach that internationally acclaimed status, we sometimes, we're quick to distance until it's like, oh yes, of course we love, Trevor Noah, for example, when he reaches that status. So is it the same when it comes to our businesses, that we're only willing to accept it once it has that seal of approval, seal of the international investment that says you're good for it?
I don't necessarily know the full on detail with regards to how it works within the startup sector, but I mean, I could only assume so. So for example, I know of someone who is creating a device that caters to people who have a hearing disability, and he's South African, and he was saying to me that he's struggling really hard in terms of getting funding from South African companies. And then when he goes overseas, people are shocked that he came up with this invention, but he is from Africa. So, if we start to ensure that a lot more investment does go towards investing in African projects, and stop waiting for the blue tick from an international market, that's when we can get to a space where we start, celebrating the ownership and creating stuff and owning that stuff. And hopefully that will allow us to also ensure that we have some form of generational, not just wealth, but knowledge that we spread to ensure that the next generation can actually add to the prosperity within our cities and our countries.
I really, really love that, the generational, because that's how one builds wealth. It's generational. People think that people one day woke up and they had all of these billions, and yes, there are some people with what is it called, new money, but a lot of you look at the ownership of the people who run some of the biggest companies, or companies that have the most impact on certain countries, it is that generational wealth that has been created as well.
Yeah, and within an African landscape, I think, as much as we continuously fight this narrative that we're not a poor continent, that, we're not a continent that's just filled with illness, there's certain things that we have still inherited, the fact that there's certain parts of countries within this continent that are still facing civil war, be it from a colonized perspective or from a tribal perspective. The fact that we have kids that are born in refugee camps. And I mean, that's a generation that does not know what it is to belong to a certain country and to have a set of aspirations to want to make their society or their community or their country even better. So we need to, this sounds so airy-fairy, but we need to be at a point where where our leaders are actually pushing for us to have some form of inheritance of advancing our continent, not just, have another generation to say, okay, you guys try now. Yeah.
I hear you. It's quite interesting. So you've spoken about things around like generational and things that need to change. Even so South Africa has been a democracy for the last 26 years. Countries like the US have been out of slavery for many years. There are essentially all the countries on the continent, to my knowledge, are all free from colonial rule. However, certain countries are still paying things like colonial tax, which you mentioned in the conversation we had, and I think my little sister had also mentioned it, but I couldn't wrap my head around the fact that there are still countries on the continent paying colonial tax. We all agree that colonization was wrong. We all can sit and have these intellectual conversations, but when but down that right, when push comes to shove, the reality is there are countries paying colonial tax. So I think to
Yeah.
maybe put it into some context is, how would you describe colonial tax?
So from my understanding, colonial tax is essentially a tax that you pay to the country that colonized you, um, basically indirectly thanking them for benefiting from colonization.
I'm sorry, what? Say that again. So the no, sorry. Sorry, this is not funny, I promise. But it's funny because I just okay.
It's
Balance.
twisted. It is really twisted. So essentially, what you have is countries like Niger and Burkina Faso. Those are francophone. So francophone countries
Yeah.
pay France colonized tax. Um, basically, they're paying them for benefiting from colonization, from
See,
being colonized.
it's I laugh because I'm actually shook. So you are
Yeah.
paying a country to say thank you for colonizing us. We've benefited from being colonized. Is that what you're saying?
So you say you're paying them because there's some benefits that you have received from being colonized. Yes.
What are these
So
benefits?
that is what I so that is what I have received from the research that I have done. I think for me, what is very striking and what is painful about it is that the fact that you have so many countries that are poverty stricken,
Mm,
and some of these countries are francophone countries, and instead of using that money to essentially benefit the people within their country, it
yeah.
has to be paid to France.
But my chat is like, you've stripped a country of their history. You've stripped a people of their generational wealth. You've stripped a country of, their story. Um, put on your kind of how you feel the world should be run and ways, and now they need to. So for me, I'm really really struggling with that concept of colonial tax, and how long. I think even them. I think I don't want to misquote, but it might even be uh, another country in Europe where basically they said that whatever country it was still paying colonial tax up until 2015. So we're not talking about countries. We're not talking about colonial tax that was 10 years ago, 20 years ago. We're talking about like literally now, like 5 years ago. You're talking about something that's still happening in this day and age.
Yeah, that's essentially it. And I mean, for me, when we have the conversation of like, Africa, your time is now, it's great. It's amazing. I mean, I am for it. I have an entire website that's dedicated to highlighting the opportunities and the prosperities in the African continent because there's so much of it. However, we also need to have a discussion about the geopolitical landscape and how, colonization has played a huge role in how certain countries are run. Heck, it's led to some countries still being in civil war. So, as much as we're talking about the prosperity of the continent from an innovation perspective, we also need to talk about the prosperity of the continent from a geopolitical landscape to say countries should not be paying colonized tax anymore. That should be cut out completely. We shouldn't be owing anyone money, and no one should have first dibs on any resources that we find within our country because it should belong to us, right? Because that's what sovereignty is about. So I think there needs to be those topics, and those conversations need to also be highlighted and brought to the forefront because not many people know about that.
Yeah, but even if you talk about artifacts, like artifacts that were stolen from African countries that are in museums overseas, you're telling me that it's even that, like, just bring back the artifacts. You stole them. There was no reason for you to take them. So I think like how do you have colonial tax? How do you have these museums and artifacts and these things that you're just like, this was from this country, and their people many years ago created these maybe statues or whatever it is, and we've just taken them to put on display. Come to our museum and see it. So they should be paying they should be not colonial tax. What would it be? What would it have been if they paid us tax? They must pay African countries tax.
Oh yeah, they should. They would be paying for a lot more than just our artifacts. But I mean, I think you're starting to see certain countries and certain European countries return some of the artifacts to some African countries. I think it's not yet a global discussion. And I think some countries may be a bit hesitant towards it. I don't know why. But I mean, you tend to do see a bit of push and pull. I remember when I did um, research on looking at manufacturing, clothing manufacturing in the continent, and how East Africa was essentially trying to just create this hub of encouraging people to invest within their own fashion industry. And I came to learn that there was an agreement called the AGOA Agreement. I think South Africa has it as well, but it's mainly based on chicken. But essentially what it means is that certain countries, mainly America, can actually, you know how the thrift market is booming in many African countries.
Yeah.
So essentially people think they're donating clothes to charities, then they dump them here and have people then sell them obviously at dirt cheap prices. But what that does is that it kills the manufacturing industry within certain countries. So the likes of Kenya and Rwanda wanted to actually put a limit or ban the dumping of clothing inventory from America, and there was a bit of pushback against that. So, I mean, as much as some countries are going to start to try and get their sovereignty back or to limit certain things to ensure that there's prosperity within their countries, we will start to see a pushback. However, you know, I'm obviously speaking from a point of not being in politics, but I think in the long run, it will have greater benefits towards that. Whether or not that will be a complete thing that's happened from the continent, we have to see. But I definitely do think that there needs to be a lot more discussion of the geopolitical landscape in ensuring that Africa can actually prosper as a continent, and that we can trade and travel a lot easier and cheaper.
Definitely. And speaking of trading and being able to travel easier, even within the continent itself. I mean, even looking ahead at the Africa Free Trade Agreement, which we are hoping will hurry up.
It just needs to happen, right? It just needs to happen.
It just needs that. I'm ready to be to have the ability to travel and trade in different countries. In your opinion, I mean, first, if you could give us just an overview on the Africa Free Trade Agreement, and then also what do you think, why do you think such an agreement has taken so long also to come into play?
So the trade agreement essentially ensures that intra-African trade is a lot more affordable and a lot more easier. And a lot more money is generated within just the circles of various African countries. The reason why I think it may have taken so long is possibly because governments couldn't get to an agreement of what they wanted. I do think certain geopolitical aspects played a huge role in terms of you know, how countries trade and what countries trade with, and how much goes to overseas and how much should remain into the continent. But I do think that this will definitely be a game changer with regards to how much more is traded, but also how much is actually traded and then manufactured within the continent and then sold overseas versus selling the raw material and then buying it back, which is what happens in a lot of times.
Which doesn't make sense. It's even that process. You know, you create it here, you sell it, and then you buy it back. You think of diamonds, gold.
So I mean, the excuse has always been that we don't have the infrastructure and we don't have the skills and we don't have the people. However, it's never stopped the countries from taking the countries or the companies from taking the raw material. But what we're starting to see is that people who some entrepreneurs within the continent are even starting to create their own spaces and companies and manufacturing companies that actually use certain raw materials. So, for example, in Nigeria, they are creating their first company that is going to actually turn, let me get the right. So they're creating their own company that is essentially going to produce oil and clean it out so that we can actually use it versus having it drained from here, from Nigeria, taken overseas and then brought back and sold, which will
Wow.
be a game changer. And also ensuring that a lot more African companies can actually have and make a good amount of money from it versus it constantly going to the likes of Shell and TPP, which are all international companies.
I love that. I love that. And I guess maybe final question on on this section is blue sky thinking as a trends analyst. What are your hopes in terms of trends, or what we'll be seeing on the continent in the next? I think 2 years is far, but it's also close. But I'd bring it closer to home and say in the next 25 years, what, in your opinion, is happening on the continent in 2025?
Ooh, goodness. Um, so for me, my money has always been on the evolution of the mobile economy. I think the likes of M-Pesa has really highlighted that um, the lack of infrastructure within our continent does not limit or prohibit innovation, and also provides a lot more opportunity with ensuring that people get access to services, get access to banking. So essentially, the growth of the mobile economy is going to continuously be in the forefront. I think we've even seeing it with how e-commerce is picking up due to COVID and people not being able to shop. But e-commerce not necessarily just from your having a computer or a laptop, but just using your phone. With that, we're going to start to see that technology will be a lot more accustomed to ensuring that it caters to African language, because we do have a lot of languages on this continent, and we need to ensure that the inventions that are there um, don't just necessarily work within a South African landscape within all their languages, but also in a Kenya perspective or in a Nigeria perspective. Um, and just ensuring that there is some form of internet access. So we've seen the likes of Facebook that's trying to create some form of access to internet within remote areas and rural areas. And we to see a lot more use of drone technology for various provisions of services. I mean, in Ghana, Zipline was the first company to use drones to deliver COVID-19 test kits in Ghana. And we've started to see a lot more countries overseas adopt that practice. That's mainly because of the blood that they were delivering within Rwanda and moved into Ghana. So I think mobile economy, drone technology, and some form of technology that will allow for access to internet access within rural and remote areas is definitely going to be at the forefront of building the technological innovation sector within the continent.
Wow, wow. I absolutely that excites me. That really does excite me, especially on the tech side. So internet access, or stronger internet access in rural areas and communities. And then what you're saying about languages. I think we're just so used to conversing, or thinking everyone at the end of the day will speak English. That I think the preservation of African culture and language is such a massive thing, and something that I'm really, really passionate about, because I think that if we don't keep that, if we don't look after that culture, and the funny thing is, like, although, I mean, for most of us, I know, especially for me, I'm not necessarily as cultural as my great 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 grandparents, but there are aspects of my culture that I hold so dear to me, and that I really appreciate when you get together in the communities, or around people from your cultural heritage and background. You're suddenly like, this is beautiful. And it's so heartbreaking to think that if we don't preserve that, the generations to come after us, you know, will never know that, will never experience that, and that's embedded in
That's
identity.
That's true. I actually did an article on IC Africa. I think it was in 2017, but
Mm,
it essentially looked at how companies were providing services or innovations that were also being cognizant of the different languages within the continent, right? When we talk about innovation, technological innovation, we also need to talk about the digitization of African languages, so that what you and I understand on a certain platform can translate to what somebody else understands within Kenya if they don't speak English, or within Ghana.
mm,
So it's great to see that we're starting, when people creating apps that don't just are not just in French and in Portuguese, but they're in Swahili as well,
yeah.
or they are in another language that is not necessarily appropriate, or is not necessarily from the West.
Mm,
And like Nando's had one brilliant campaign, and I actually wish it could continue, is how, when you type in an African name. So for example, if I type in Khumo on Word, it puts a red line underneath to say, actually, you might have misspelled this. And I'm like, no, I haven't. That's my name. So what they were encouraging is for people to actually just to add their names into a database, that the next time you send something digitally, it wouldn't have an underlining mark underneath your name, because your name is not incorrect.
mm,
Um, and if we're starting to see a lot more of technology that is actually allowing for an option of, switching between English or Swahili and Portuguese, or Ibugu, or Tswana and Zulu.
I really like that. Sure. Excited to see that. I'm excited for 2025 already, as it is. Uh, hey,
We got to get through COVID first.
we gotta get. We gotta dream. We gotta dream. If you can see it, you
No,
can.
definitely, right? Definitely.
All right.
Hope will,
Hey,
hope will get us very far.
hope will get us there. They say the power of meditation. So in the evening, I'm just meditate on 2025. It'll come sooner than we think. Actually, no, I'll be 35. Never mind.
Now it must slow down.
Back up, back up, back up. We're not ready. We're not ready. Um, all right, so switching gears into, because we still are, our 20s.
Oh,
How
goodness.
how would you summarize your 20s journey?
A work in progress.
What do you mean by a work in progress? How would you unpack that?
I think I am I am learning that life is a journey.
Mm-hmm.
I'm one that always has like a plan. And life is what happens when you're busy making plans.
Mm-hmm.
So life is a journey, in that you're not always going to get what you want. Sometimes you're not even going to get what you thought you wanted. Um, and that things will not always go as planned, but sometimes it's for a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
And that whatever happens, try to take a lesson out of it, because you're going to continuously grow. So every chapter in my life, I'm trying to take in the fact that I'm a work in progress. Everything that happens is me building up towards being a better person, I hope. But to being a better person, yeah. So my life is a work in progress, and that's what my 20s have taught me.
Oh, sure. Undoubtedly, almost every episode, and I don't know why, it's one of those triggering things for me when people say like 20s is a work in progress, or you have to unlearn a lot of things and then, come to a foundational spot and relearn everything, is because it just resonates so strong. And I hear it repeated over and over and over again. And a lot of people in their 20s feel like they're the only people going through whatever it is they're going through. And when you're able to have these discussions and say things like, I'm a work in progress, or, you just got to get through it, or even understanding that when you start your 20s, you're basically a teenager. You've literally dipped over from 19 into 20, you're basically
Yeah.
still 19. And then at the end of your 20s, you're a full grown adult. It's like the biggest transition ever. And no one like focuses on like, what are the changes? This is not like, I was going to say this is not puberty, but it's like, it's like, I really think it's one of the biggest changes. And we never sit and actually go, this is what I've done. I'm not the person I was, 5 years ago. I'm not the person I was at 20 or 21 or 22. And I'm a very different person towards the end of my 20s. There's a maturity, there's a growth. But it's quite fascinating. And speaking of growth and stuff, have you experienced the quarter life crisis, or any like turmoil periods in your 20s? And if you
No,
have,
I feel like every day is a crisis. I think for me, so I've had, let me think. I think for me, I've had 3 experiences, not crisis, but experiences that were just like, wow, okay,
yeah,
this is life. In 2010, I was not in my 20s then. However, it's always reminded me that life can change, and that, take as much as you can from a person, and also that, when they say you have, I have the solid belief that you live for a purpose, and once that purpose is done,
yeah,
it's done, whether people have taken from it or not. And that was when my grandfather passed away, because he was like the pillar of our family.
yeah.
And then, like 7 weeks later, my aunt passed away, and she was also like the stronghold. And I think when I saw 2 really strong people within my family pass away, I realized that, take what you can from the people that you meet, and try to always instill those things in your life, because I can sit back and count back, like, this is what my grandfather always wanted for us, and this is what I remember my grandfather for. And take that with you, because it will help you in terms of your work ethic, or in terms of how you treat people.
Yeah.
And then I think the second lesson that I learned was that you can always get through something. You'll always make it through something. And I mean, that's just been financial challenges that have hit home.
Yeah.
And then the third one, still in regard to always get through something, was they had a family member who had a life and death experience, and watching that person survive, learn how to live and be amongst people again, was just, I get chills, was just groundbreaking. I've never had to experience something so close to home, but also see it as a level of understanding that life doesn't always happen the way that you want it to. However, difficult challenges build you.
It's sure, it's there's a lot that you've kind of like put together, but I think, even just hearing you speak about, certain moments or key moments of hardship in your 20s, it's always those moments in life where you remember that life, that saying life is short, that yes, life is short, but also in the same breath, learning to enjoy those moments. I think sometimes we get so caught up in the day-to-day of going to work and arguments with certain people, and then family time, and it almost becomes like we're, without knowing it, we get into this routine of what we think we should be doing, and not knowing the value of having a spiritual connection to God, or something that is bigger and greater than us, whatever we may. And we just think that this is it, and And it's those moments, those human moments, where you're kind of like, wow, you know, just.
And also, I think it's also just it's being okay with the uncertainty. You know, life has done that to us right now. We were 3 months ago, we were meeting up, talking, no one wearing a mask, you know, shaking hands and hugging. And then literally so quickly we are in a space where we don't know if we're going to work tomorrow. We don't know if we should go to the mall, but also trusting that God has everything under control. And trusting that you may not necessarily know what the next step is, but He does. And praying for the guidance, to be patient, for the strength to go through whatever the next step may be, and to survive it as well. Because I mean, that's what it is. Essentially, we've learned that we're not in control as we think we are. Nothing is in control. Except for God. If you believe in God.
Oh, that's really quite powerful. I'm not going to lie. And on that note, I mean, this has been one of those discussions, you know, where it's like it's like the perfect TV show episode. It's like, you know, script, plot twist, emotion, comeback, resolution. I literally feel this taking me on a journey. But what piece of advice would you have for people in their 20s right now?
So something someone very close to me has said, and I think I will take this with me for as long as I'm here, is that God always gives you something. Gives you a talent, He gives you a skill. You know, when things are difficult and you don't know what you're going to do from a financial perspective, from a career perspective, from a life perspective, just sit back in a quiet space and think about what skill you have, what resource you have, and use it, because there's a reason why you have it.
Wisdom builds a house. Thank you so much for that, and thank you for a lovely discussion. I feel a little bit more smarter. Like I feel like wise.
Oh, really? Oh, I'm so thankful.
I'm gonna go and tell someone. I'm gonna give them a quote from you know, the Africa Innovation part in a discussion, and then people be like, "You're so smart." I'm like, "I know."
You are smart. You are smart.
Power. Anyway, so much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you so much for having me. I always love talking to you. I told you this, and I will tell you again. I could speak with you for hours on end.
And I imagine one day we can record a podcast episode.
We should. Oh, we so should. That is happening. But it mustn't be like that. You know that happening when you're like, oh, I'm going to see you. And then like 6 months later, like, remember when we were supposed to meet? Oh, we're so bad. And like, we'll see each other again. And then 6 months later, no, we should.
No, we're doing it.
We're doing it.